Hello and welcome, students, to another episode of History at Home. In today's episode, we'll be going over a brief introduction to ancient Egypt and some of the basic ideas involving the beginnings of ancient Egypt. So, the first thing that we're going to start with is geography. And geography is super important to understanding really any ancient civilization. The world of the ancients revolved around their natural settings. The religion of the people in different regions developed around the rivers and the natural phenomena that they experienced in their day to day world. So, geography has a profound impact on the way that history develops within a certain civilization. So, let's start there in our early examinations of ancient Egypt. So, if we look at Africa from outer space and try to locate Egypt, we would have to look in northern Africa, right up here where you see the red circle appear. And you'll see a couple big time features around ancient Egypt. You would see the Mediterranean Sea to the north, you would see the Red Sea off to the east, and then dominating northern Africa is the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert makes up roughly 1/3 of all of Africa. So, we talked about this with Mesopotamia, and it also includes Egypt. This is part of an ancient area known as the Fertile Crescent. And if we went back in time roughly 5,000, 6,000 years ago, this location would have some of the best farmland on the planet. And if we zoomed in on that area in green, you would find modern day countries like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and now our new focus, ancient Egypt. And from the Persian Gulf all the way towards the Mediterranean and Red Seas, you would have found this green band of lush farmland. Again, it would have been some of the best farmland on the planet roughly 5 to 6,000 years ago. So the Fertile Crescent is the name given to a huge area of land where the world's first permanent communities appeared. And within this band, roughly 5 to 6,000 years ago, you would have found the world's first agricultural communities where people were practicing agriculture and building very dense populated centers, eventually forming cities in this green band across the Middle East. And it includes modern day countries like Iraq, which was ancient Mesopotamia, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Turkey. So it's a very large area of land, and it spans across two continents. It spans across Asia, and it goes into the northern tip of Africa and Egypt. It's given the name the Fertile Crescent because that first word, fertile, means productive. So this is, again, very productive farmland. And it's called the crescent because it has the shape of a crescent. So if we think of the crescent phase of the moon or a croissant that you get from a bakery, it has that arced shaped. That's why it's called the Fertile Crescent. We also just finished up studying Mesopotamia, and we looked at the two rivers of Mesopotamia, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. We discussed how those rivers flooded very violently and unpredictably between the months of March and May. However, Egypt is centered around the Nile River. And the Nile River is almost the complete opposite and has kind of the opposite qualities of the Euphrates and Tigris. It's the world's longest river at about 4,258 miles long, but it does flood like any river, but it floods predictably and peacefully. So, again, kind of the opposite ideas from Mesopotamia. And it will flood predictably and peacefully between June and September. And this flooding is very beneficial to the ancient Egyptians. It's peaceful, it's reliable, and it's incredibly predictable. And it's arguably the best river out of any of our ancient civilizations to form a civilization around in the ancient world. So when the Nile River floods, it's going to deposit a natural fertilizer known as silt. Same basic process as we discussed in Mesopotamia. So when the rivers flood, the silt from the bottom of the Nile spills onto the farmland. It re-energizes the farmland and keeps it productive, which allows us to grow more food, which allows us to have more people. And eventually this all builds up into that grand idea of a civilization. So the silt is trapped at the bottom of the riverbed. It's made of decomposed plants and dead animals that fall into the rivers or float in the rivers. And this fertilizer is trapped usually at the bottom of the river. However, when it floods, it all gets stirred up with the water as it rushes through the river valley. And when it floods onto the land nearby, it re energizes and reinvigorates the farmland and allows farmers to produce more food, which equals more people and eventually grander civilizations. The sources for the Nile River are towards the south, and there's two main sources. One is Lake Victoria here in red, and then off to the northeast are the Ethiopian highlands. So when the snow melts in these mountains, the liquid water flows down the mountainsides, it enters into the river valley, and the Nile stems from down here in Lake Victoria and it heads all the way northward and eventually empties out here into the Mediterranean Sea over 4,200 miles later. So, again, very predictable and peaceful flooding in Egypt. And there's three big seasons in the Egyptian calendar. The first one is Akhet, and this is called the inundation season. The inundation season is when the Nile River will flood. This is when the farmers could not farm. The land was just simply unworkable at the time, and the farmers would be forced to pay their burden tax at this time. They would be conscripted or pulled off their farms by the government and forced to build projects throughout the civilization. Most notably, the pyramids up at Giza, which is right around here in the Nile Delta. So there used to be this old conception that the pyramids were built by slaves. Turns out that is not true. The pyramids at Giza were actually not built by slaves, but rather by conscripted farmers pulled off of their farmland during the inundation season. So they're not slaves, they're technically farmers that were building the Great Pyramids. And we'll examine that idea a little bit further down the road. A second season in the Egyptian calendar was called Piret, and that was when the farmers would be released from their burden tax and they would return to their farms and they would begin planting for the next season or for the next harvest. And then you have Shemu, which is from March to May, and that is when the crops have grown and they're ready to be harvested. So you'll have farmers working their land, picking plants, sickling plants, and collecting food to eventually help feed and drive the civilization. Another unusual characteristic of the Nile is the idea that it flows from south to north. This is actually kind of common with rivers. It's not defying gravity by flowing from south to north. Um, in fact, it's really just flowing in the direction of least resistance. So we have this kind of what seems to be a flip-flopped idea. We have Upper Egypt in the south of Egypt, a formerly independent kingdom, which we'll talk about soon. And then to the north, we have Lower Egypt. So the Nile is going to flow from the source, which is Lake Victoria in the Ethiopian highlands, and it's going to flow from south to north until it reaches the Nile Delta and eventually filters out into the Mediterranean Sea in the north. Last, we have the Nile Delta in the very north of Egypt, and this is the location where the Nile begins to diverge and break off into many different streams and little smaller rivers and filters out into the Mediterranean Sea. You have some really productive farmland up here in Lower Egypt. And the word itself, the delta, the word delta is a Greek word that means triangle. So when we look at this area of northern Egypt, you see how it has this vague three-sided shaped area. It looks like a triangle, so that's why it's called the delta. It has that triangular shape. A famous historian from the ancient world is Herodotus, and Herodotus is the world's first historian. He's going to travel throughout the Mediterranean region in the ancient world, and he's going to call Egypt the gift of the Nile. What he simply means by this is that without the Nile, life would not be possible in Egypt. Egypt is mostly 90% of it, in fact, is made up of desert. Really, the only place life can exist in Egypt is on either bank of the Nile River. So Egypt is the gift of the Nile because without it, we would not have life in Egypt. A famous tool that the Egyptians will use and Egyptian farmers will use to help them plant is called the Nile Meter. And the Nile Meter was invented to measure the flood levels of the Nile River. And here's how it works. The Nile Meter is a staircase and it descends down into a pit. And then you'll see these etchings every so often on the side wall of the pit. And what this helps us do is predict the flood levels. If we have a level that is higher than what's called 18 cubics of water, we can expect a terrible flood, and this would give people time to prepare and evacuate from these floods. If you had something as low as 13 or 12 cubics of water, that would mean the flood for that season would be unusually low, and they would have to prepare and possibly go into their surplus, into the granary to collect surplus grains in order to feed the population. But typically, the Nile would fall somewhere between 16 and 14 cubics, which is just the perfect amount of water needed for Egypt and Egyptian farmers to grow food. The natural resources of Mesopotamia, we said, had very little natural resources. In fact, the best natural resource of Mesopotamia is mud. So they would use mud bricks to build houses, temples, buildings, etc. However, in Egypt, the best natural resource is limestone and different types of hard rocks. So when we look at Egypt, they had an abundance of limestone and other items for building. And it's one of the reasons why ancient Egypt is so well preserved and today such a hot topic of study for many historians. There are so many ruins and famous artifacts and buildings and temples that are still standing in ancient Egypt because they were built from resilient products like limestone. So this would be the Great Temple of Ramesses II, and you can see this is a 4,000-year-old building that is still in remarkably good shape, and it's because it was built from a very resilient ingredient known as limestone, which is a very dense and heavy rock. It's the same item that was used to make the pyramids at Giza, and it's one of the reasons why we have so many awesome artifacts from ancient Egypt. Lastly, we talked about the natural protection of Mesopotamia, and we said that Mesopotamia lacked natural protection. It was in the middle of the known world for the time period, and it was located on a flat and open plain. Egypt, again, is kind of the opposite idea here. It's got some of the best natural protection of any ancient civilization. They have the Sahara Desert that insulates it from really any region nearby. They have a very large sea to the north, known as the Mediterranean Sea. And even in the highway of ancient Egypt, the Nile, there are a series of different rocky passages known as the cataracts, which makes it difficult to navigate the Nile in certain regions. So the natural protection of Egypt. We have the Sahara Desert, which is over 2,000 miles from coast to coast, from the Atlantic over to the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. We have over 2,000 miles. That is larger than the United States. So if you hopped in a plane from New Jersey and flew all the way to California, that's pretty much the same distance that we're talking here. The Sahara Desert is also the world's second largest desert. It's just behind Antarctica. A desert is an area of land that receives less than 10 inches of precipitation in a given year. Antarctica technically receives less precipitation than the Sahara Desert in a given year, so therefore it is a larger desert, even though it's very cold. And if we look at Egypt from space at night, we can see clearly the Nile River as it zigzags from south to north. You can see densely populated areas on either side of the Nile River. So here's where people will live. We can see people living on the coasts of the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. But you can really see how insulated Egypt is from the rest of the world when we look at these black voids out here. This is where the Sahara Desert is at, a very vicious and inhospitable place for people to try to survive. Therefore, people won't live out here. If you're a invading army and you are being commanded to march and you know that you have to cross portions of the Sahara Desert, it's really going to deter you from even attempting to invade ancient Egypt. So this would be a giant buffer from Egypt and other civilizations that exist nearby. The Mediterranean Sea to the north, right up here. It's about 500 miles from ancient Greece to sail across the Mediterranean Sea into northern Egypt. So again, a really good buffer between Greece and eventually Rome up here in Italy. And then we have the Nile River. We have different sets of rocky rapids known as cataracts throughout the Nile, which makes it difficult to navigate from one place to another. So even when you do get into Egypt and you want to utilize the best natural resource, which is the river, if you're a foreigner, it's going to be very difficult to navigate in the Nile River because you don't know the correct routes or ways around these cataracts, and you might ground your ship and wreck your ship. So this is a difficult place to navigate, and it's going to protect Egypt from foreign invasions for a very long period of time. So, as far as geography is concerned, and these are many different things that we've discussed already in class, let's keep these ideas in mind. Egypt is part of the Fertile Crescent, and the Nile is the lifeblood of ancient Egypt. Herodotus says that it is the gift of the Nile. Egypt would not exist without the help of the Nile River. Egypt is also incredibly well protected naturally from possible invaders. They will get conquered at different points in history by different groups of foreign invaders. You have the Hyksos that come in at one point in time, conquer them. You have the Nubians from the south that will conquer parts of Egypt. You'll have the Greeks that will conquer Egypt for a period of time. The Romans famously conquer Egypt. But for a large period of time, 2,000 to 3,000 years, Egypt will develop uninterrupted and uninvaded from other civilizations. And the reasons why is because it is so well naturally protected, and it's protected by items such as the Sahara Desert, the Mediterranean Sea, and the cataracts of the Nile. So here's a new idea, something that we haven't talked in previous episodes or haven't looked at quite yet in class. We're going to look at the chronology of ancient Egypt. How is ancient Egypt organized? We're talking about a civilization that existed for about 5,000 years. How do historians organize that large block of time into smaller segments? So let's look at the chronology of ancient Egypt. So we have four big time periods in ancient Egyptian history. We have the early dynastic period, we have the Old Kingdom, we have the Middle Kingdom, and then lastly we have the New Kingdom. And the earliest portion is the early dynastic period. That's the oldest segment of Egyptian history. And then as we flow to the right, we get to a more recent time period moving forward. So the early dynastic period is the oldest of the four, and the New Kingdom is the most recent of the four. So let's look at different events that kind of happen, and we'll look at these more in depth in class later down the road, but let's look at different ideas in these four big time periods of Egyptian history. So the early dynastic period happened between 3100 BCE and 2685 BCE. So we're looking at over 5,000 years ago. And during this time period, the big event that happens in this chunk of time is the kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt will be united, and this is the foundation of ancient Egypt. A pharaoh that we'll look at from this time period is the famous pharaoh Narmer, also known as Menes. And we're going to look at this artifact from the early dynastic time period. This is called the Narmer Palette. And this one singular artifact gives us a ton of information on how ancient Egypt became united. How did these formerly independent kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt become one unified country that we today call Egypt? We get that all from this palette known as the Narmer Palette, and we'll examine this in the different scenes within the Narmer Palette in class in a couple days. We just threw out that term, Pharaoh. There's a couple things to know about that word, Ferrum. It is the ruler of ancient Egypt, and the Pharaoh of ancient Egypt would wear the pharaonic crown known as the double crown. So this is the official crown of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and this is what you could expect to see the king or queen wearing for the time period. And this term is unique to Egyptian history. You can't use the word pharaoh with any other ruler or any other civilization. It is unique and singular to Egypt. When you hear the words pharaoh, you should automatically think of ancient Egypt. The pharaohs will also establish dynasties, and we know what a dynasty is. A dynasty is when one family is in power for many generations. So the crown will stay within one family. It will typically be passed from father to son. And in Egyptian history, we're looking at over 31 different dynasties, 31 different royal families that will rule for different periods of time, from the early dynastic period all the way to the collapse of ancient Egypt during the New Kingdom. And the term itself actually means great house. The word pharaoh actually originally was describing the palace that the king or queen lived in. It eventually came to be known as the title of the ruler itself. So when we say the word pharaoh, what we're really referring to is the king or queen of Egypt during that time period. So those are big events of the early dynastic period. Between these periods, where you see these dotted lines, we have what are called intermediate periods where Egypt is kind of falling apart either because of natural disasters or famine or because of invasions. You don't really have a stable monarchy or stable dynasty ruling over Egypt. So that's why these time periods kind of seem to jump a little bit and kind of gloss over a chunk of time. We're not really going to look at the intermediate periods. If you became a hardcore Egyptologist, an Egyptologist is a historian that studies ancient Egypt, you would know more information um, which happens during those time periods. We can kind of gloss over them for the purposes of our class. So the Old Kingdom happens later down the road. It happens between 2575 BCE and 2150 BCE. And this is what we think of in our mind when we think about ancient Egypt. The pyramids and the Sphinx were built during the Old Kingdom time period. And they're built at Giza, which is right outside the modern day capital of Egypt, which is Cairo. And this is also a time period where mummification becomes the norm, that unusual cultural practice of the Egyptians. We'll look at that process in more detail later in our studies. And during this time period, the most famous pharaoh from the time period is Khufu. Khufu is the pharaoh who builds the first massive pyramid at Giza. And a pyramid is just simply a tomb for his body to rest in. Then we're going to look at the Middle Kingdom, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom spans from 1975 BCE to 1640 BCE, and we're going to look at a story from this time period known as the Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor. And we'll see different perspectives on Egyptian religion and gods and goddesses in this primary source that we'll examine in class. And the most famous pharaoh from this time period is Amenemhet, who was a pharaoh towards the end of the Middle Kingdom. Lastly, we're going to finally examine the Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdom is my favorite segment of Egyptian history. This is kind of the most famous and kind of densely action-packed segment of Egyptian history. So this happens between 1520 BCE and 1075 BCE, and it's got a ton of big-time events occurring during that time period. During this time period, we have the first Egyptian pharaoh, female pharaoh in history, known as Hatshepsut. We have this huge temple known as the Temple of Karnak being built. We have the official royal burial ground of the pharaohs, known as the Valley of the Kings, in southern Egypt. We have a very unusual glimpse in history, a little blip on the radar in which monotheism comes into play, and polytheism is disbanded in ancient Egypt. We have the crazy heretical ruler Akhenaten ruling and having people of Egypt pray to this obscure sun god known as Aten, a really unusual shift in human history. And we also had that most famous discovery, archaeological discovery in archaeological history, which is the discovery of King Tut's tomb by Howard Carter in 1922 CE. Again, kind of a laundry list of famous pharaohs from this time period. We're going to kind of look at each one briefly. We're going to look at Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, that crazy, heretical pharaoh in Egyptian history. He's the guy who converts Egypt from a brief period of time from polytheism to monotheism and the worship of the obscure sun god Aten. We have his wife Nefertiti. We have Akhenaten's son Tutankhamun, most commonly known as King Tut. And then we're going to finally wrap up with maybe the most important pharaoh in all of Egyptian history, and that is the great pharaoh Ramesses II. All right, guys, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.